Hello, everyone. Welcome. This is our June webinar that we're hosting. Thank you so much all for being here. From plans to equitable change, how community partnerships can encourage walkability. We're going to get started in just a couple minutes. We're going to let everybody kind of shuffle in. All right, we have the numbers ticking up a little bit. We're going to go ahead and get started in about 1 minute. All right, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming. We're going to go ahead and get started. So welcome to today's America Walks webinar, From Plans to Equitable Change, Community Partnerships to Encourage Walkability. Today we have our webinar facilitator, Mike McGinn, who's on the call. He is our executive director here at America Walks. We just wanted to give a quick shout out to our partners who help make these great events possible and help support our work. And then thank you all for supporting and sharing our webinars with your communities. There is a link in the chat that I'm going to put here in just a couple minutes if you would like to donate and see grassroots organizing continue through America Walks. And then just a quick tech thing, if you have a question, you can put it in the chat there. You'll see that in the questions tab of the GoToWebinar control panel. And then also there will be a recording of this uploaded onto our YouTube channel at the end of today's broadcast. Today's webinar speakers are Sagar, Shah, and Joe Peña, which I'm going to pass it to Mike so he can go ahead and introduce them.
Thanks, Kate. So yeah, we're very excited to have our presenters here from the American Planning Association. Sagar Shah is the Planning and Community Health Manager at the American Planning Association. And in this job, he creates training and education to help local planning practitioners integrate health and equity into their planning practice. Sagar holds a PhD in Regional Development Planning from the University of Cincinnati and a master's degree in planning from the University of Southern California. He is an accredited planner with the American Institute of Certified Planners. Joe Peña is a research associate at the American Planning Association. She provides research support on projects related to resilience, community health, equity, and interdisciplinary collaboration. Recently, she's been involved in projects related to increasing physical activity through the built environment, hazard mitigation, environmental health, and increasing connectivity between community resilience initiatives across planning activities. Jo received her master's in urban planning and policy degree from the University of Illinois at Chicago, where she specialized in environmental planning. This work is made possible by support from the Centers for Disease Control's Active People, Healthy Nation program. And their goal is to build support for creating the types of environments where people can get activity out of their everyday lives. And so we're just excited to hear the presentations from Sagar and Joe about the role in which, the ways in which planning can intersect with community interests. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sagar to lead. After the presentations, I'll ask a couple of questions and then we'll take questions from the audience. So please get them teed up. And Sagar, the show is yours.
Thank you, Mike. Hello, everyone. Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. Thank you, Joe, for sharing your screen. So today, I, along with my colleague, Joe Peña, are going to talk about encouraging walkability in your neighborhoods and communities, and what is the role of planning, land use planning in that. Next slide, please. And the agenda today is basically, I will talk a little bit about, provide some foundation and background on planning and land use planning. Then we'll talk about the project that we recently completed. And after which we will sort of provide 2 or 3 examples of planning approaches that community members can implement to increase access or support everyday destinations. And then we end with question and answers. But before I talk about some foundation things in planning, I would like to talk a little bit briefly about the organization that I work with, considering that all of you may not know APA. I and Joe both work at American Planning Association, we are 501c3 nonprofit corporation, a membership association for planners, so something like APHA, but for planners. We have about 40,000 plus members, and most of our members, not all, but most of them work at local level, which means they work at municipality level or county level. We have 23 divisions, which are topic based, like transportation division or housing division. And then we have, or group based, so they can be like women in planning is another division. So we have 23 divisions and 47 chapters, and these chapters are geographically distributed. So I would say approximately each state has like one APA chapter. And our mission is creating great communities for all. Next. In terms of APA's value proposition, we are an educational organization, so we create knowledge, education, training to improve planning practice and deliver it to our members. We also provide a community of planners, right? Networking opportunities, peer-to-peer support, learning from each other side of community to practicing planners. We do advocacy. We don't do lobbying, but we do advocacy at federal level. And we also help our state chapters do state level advocacy. And we also have American certified planners part of APA. So we also certify planners and take care about the continuing education requirements. Next, please. So now I'll talk a little bit about planning and land use planning. And when we were sort of prepping for this session, we were talking with Mike, and Mike asked an interesting question, like, what is planning? And I thought, well, this is a good way to start the presentation. So here it is, what is planning, right? I'd say planning is visionary, right? It is about vision for the community today and in the future. One of the greatest challenges for planners is to figure out what can and should happen to a community. And this is decided not like on a table or, well, 5 planners come together and let's do something about community. No, it works in collaboration with community members. It depends on the data and the projection of the trends in terms of what is the growth of population, economic development, what is happening with environment, etc. And there are other various factors that comes into consideration to figure out how to manage growth so that it is in the best interest of the residents. That's the key for planners, that the work that planners do should be in the best interest of residents. And the goal of planning since its inception has been to maximize health, safety, and well-being of all people. And talking about well-being, planners are always working towards different kinds of well-being. Joe, you can go to the next. So well-being means economic well-being, means social well-being, and also physical well-being. And when we say physical well-being, we mean well-being in terms of natural environment and built environment. All these things are important in order to create great communities for everyone. Next slide. And when it comes to public health, it has been a foundational goal of planning to improve or maximize health. And which is not a surprise because there was sort of no distinction between both the professions at the end of 19th century. But with beginning of 20th century, the modern planning and public health sort of started diverging. And they kept diverging till like about 1980s, at which time the importance of the social factors, importance of social determinants of health, including built environment, was emphasized. And the collaboration between urban planning and public health started happening. And there is more increased collaboration with every year passing, which is a great news for both planners and public health professionals. Next. Talking about health and health outcomes, I'm pretty sure a lot of you already have seen this graphic many times. It shows various factors that influences health, right? The one thing I would like to mention here is many times when I've seen people present it, it is understood that when it comes to physical environment is what planners influence, which is correct. But there are other factors in other categories that planners influence as well. So in terms of social and economic factors, when it comes to community safety, planners play an important role. When it comes to clinical care, access to care, in terms of physical access to healthcare, is sort of falls in the realm of planning. And when it comes to health behaviors, which we are going to talk today, diet and exercise, is sort of the behavior is influenced by your built environment, and thus planners play an important role. So just wanted to bring this graphic in front of you and show the various levels at which planners influence health. Next slide, please. And talking about the main domains for which, through which planners influence health are the domains that you see on the slide. It's a messy slide, I understand. I'll go through very briefly each of the domains. Environmental exposure, right? Clean air, water, soil falls in the realm of what planners can do. Emergency preparedness when it comes to climate adaptation and mitigation, including natural hazards. And now we know more and more about how planners can play a role in infectious diseases, is how planners can influence health. Social cohesion in terms of housing, community development, public safety is where planners can influence. And then food systems planning, which is access to healthy food as well as production of healthy food, where planners, land use planning, design, etc., plays an important role. And last but not the least, of course, active living, for which we all have gathered today to talk about, includes active transportation, recreation, and traffic safety, which is very much in the realm of transportation planning and all sorts of other planners, work that planners do, including land use planning and zoning, which we'll be talking about today. Next slide. And talking about active living, Mike, thank you for shout out. We have to mention CDC's Active People Healthy Nation, which aims to help 27 million Americans become more physically active by 2027. And integral part of this particular aspect is, next slide, Joe, is activity-friendly routes to everyday destinations, right? There were few strategies, handful of strategies that have been identified to help people improve their physical activity. And this is an important component of those strategies. Now, as part of the strategy, there are two aspects to this. One is activity-friendly routes, which are very important, and then routes that leads to everyday destinations. That is also important. There is some literature, there is resources available that talks about how to create activity-friendly routes and what is the role of activity-friendly routes in increasing physical activity and thus improve health. There is a little bit less resources or less literature in terms of connection of everyday destinations to the activity-friendly routes and the impact of that particular aspect on health. So for the purposes of today's presentation, we want to focus on everyday destinations aspect of this particular strategy. Next, please. Now, to understand the role of planners, land use planning, etc., in supporting everyday destinations, we need to look at the core activities that planners are involved in. And I'm not going to talk a lot about this, but the 5 main strategic points that you see on the slide are bread and butter stuff for planners. So most of the local planners are working on this stuff. It includes long-range community visioning, plan making, standards, regulations, policies, and incentives, development work, including development review and approving of projects, and public investments, which are directly and indirectly influenced by planners. For the purposes of today's presentation, we are going to mainly focus on plan making, which includes land use planning, and talk a little bit about standards regulations, which are zoning regulations, which is sort of how you implement land use planning. Next, please. So now I'll provide a little bit like a foundation background on land use planning and zoning very, very quickly. But I thought, having talked with Mike, I thought it was really important to like sort of start here before we talk about specific land use and zoning approaches that we have recommended through our project. So I think many of you, or maybe most of you, know land use is a type of activity that occurs on a parcel of land, right? So it can be any use, industrial, residential, commercial, and the look of the community depends on what the use is. And of course, mixed use development is very important for encouraging physical activity. Next. Now, land use plans are created as part of comprehensive planning process, which is a blueprint for growth and development of a community for a certain time frame. And usually it is, sometimes it's 5 years, but usually it is 10 to 20 years. So it is sort of creates a blueprint of how the growth and development will happen in the community. An important thing to note here is when it comes to land use planning, when planners are creating comprehensive plans and land use plans as part of comprehensive plans, they consider where private and public developments and infrastructure should be located. So this is important for our purposes for today's discussion, right? That is an important trigger point where planners can help divert developments and infrastructure in the places that require the most. And of course, this is done in collaboration with input from community members. So it's not a standalone process. It is a very collaborative process that happens with community members. So it's a good way to think about where those developments and infrastructure funding as well as plans are going. Next. Now, this slide is about zoning. Land use plans, as I mentioned, are part of comprehensive plans. And zoning, but land use plans have recommendations, strategies, and policies. They are not enforceable. In order to enforce land use planning or land use plans, we use zoning. Planners use zoning as a tool, right? So land use plan and zoning are in most cases aligned with each other, and land use sort of forms the backbone for developing zoning codes and zoning ordinances. Zoning divides a community into districts and specifies a different set of rules for specific districts, and sometimes a specific area has separate sets of rules, but they are enforceable, which is very important. And here is an example on the slide you see as the type of basic set of aspects that you see in a zoning ordinance or a zoning code, right? It will talk about the use of the land. It will talk about the intensity or density of the development that is happening on a parcel. It will also talk about the height, bulk, and placement of the structure. So what should the setback, how much height should be, what is the scale of the building, etc. And we'll also talk about amount and design of parking. So how many parking spaces does a particular development need, where it should be in the front of the building or the back of the building, etc. Now, these are only some very basic core issues that are part of zoning. Zoning code are much more than this, and a lot of things can happen with zoning codes. Next, please. So why do we need land use and zoning, right? As I mentioned, the core goal of planning is to protect health, safety, and welfare, and zoning and land use helps us do it. Sometimes there are unintended consequences, and sometimes intended consequences where there are inequities, etc., which does not protect the health, safety, and welfare. But generally, the goal is to protect health, safety, and welfare of people. It is also to sort of plan future development of the communities, as I mentioned, because land use and zoning goes hand in hand. They can be used for future development and planning of it. It also guides where people live and work. This is important for physical activity because there are everyday destinations are important, but also the proximity between those everyday destinations and where people live is important. So land use and zoning also helps with that. One more thing to mention is it also protects businesses and residences from incompatible neighbors. So we don't want, for example, an industrial complex next to an hospital, right? So it also helps to separate incompatible land uses and neighbors. Next, please. In the context of active living, I would like to emphasize this, that the traditional form of doing land use planning, where uses were separated, had a lot of, not great outcomes for sustainability, for health, for various aspects of well-being for the people, etc. Because it led to urban sprawl, low density development, neglect of pedestrians, and lack of strict connectivity. So that is sort of like a traditional way, I would say about few decades old way of doing land use planning. Today, however, most of the communities, you will find innovations to promote active living. So for example, pedestrian overlay district, which is nothing but a specific area in the community where pedestrians are given importance, where zoning is changed to support pedestrian activity or active living. Inclusionary zoning, where we talk about how affordable housing should be part of housing developments in urban centers or centers that are highly priced. Also, there are a lot of other zoning activities, zoning innovative methods that are related to traditional neighborhood development and new urbanism, like transit-oriented development, where the development, mixed-use development, mostly comes around transit, so that people don't have to travel in cars, but take the transit to the work. Form-based code, which is really important to preserve the character of the community and give importance to form. So there are a lot of innovations happening in zoning. So don't think zoning as sort of separating things. It is one of the role of zoning, but there are various innovative ways that we can improve zoning codes to support active living. Next, please. And I know I'm going to hand it over to Joe Peña, my colleague, to talk about the project that we worked on, but I would like to end my part this to just mention that we can't do much if the safe streets or activity friendly streets don't connect destinations, right? It's good for people who have resources. It is good for people who are motivated enough and have time. But in order for many more people to involve in physical activity, we need to integrate physical activity into daily lives of people. And that's what Active People Healthy Nation does. And for that to happen, we need to have, or we should have, activity-friendly routes that are connected to everyday destinations. And hopefully our work that Joe is going to present would help you do that. I'll hand over to Joe. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, Sagar. Yeah, so we are going to talk about some tools that are available to you in your community if you're looking to make change happen, encourage people to take a walk and explore their communities. There's lots of different ways to do that. And so Sagar and I embarked on a journey a couple of months ago to figure out what makes sense to present as options for physical activity with support from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and America Walks. And so we are going to go ahead and explore what does this tool look like, where can you access it, and what does it have to offer your community. So yeah, we'll quickly take a look at the website and then we'll review some components that are constant throughout the product. And then we'll also talk about some ideas on how to use the product. Before we do that, I'm going to come back to the signpost here for Active People Healthy Nation, just to contextualize a little bit of what we're creating here. So Kate showed this image earlier. I believe Sagar might have showed it as well. The one thing to add to that conversation here is that the foundation for this conversation is equitable, inclusive access, right? So all of these different approaches that different folks are working on to create products are all centered on equitable and inclusive access. So we're just going to talk about half of the purple signpost, that everyday destinations piece, and we'll also briefly talk about routes. But you might be asking yourself, what are everyday destinations? We've said that word a couple of times. So we have a little tool here to share what that actually translates to. So CDC defines everyday destinations as places that are accessible by walking, bicycling, or public transportation. They are desirable, they are useful, and they're attractive. And they include places that you might visit on a regular basis, perhaps on a daily basis, things like grocery stores, schools, libraries, and parks. The image that you see here is from CDC, and you can see different examples of the activity-friendly routes. So those are the purple lines that you see. And then on the side, you see examples of destinations circled in green. So it requires both parts of that conversation. You need the activity-friendly routes, and you also need the destinations. So what can we do about destinations? We spent time looking at a variety of approaches that communities have taken to increase their vitality, community vitality. And these different activities range from short-term projects that could be implemented maybe within 6 months to things that might take longer than 6 years potentially, if done with the proper amount of community engagement. And so our goal with identifying all of these different approaches was to provide entry points for folks, regardless of where they're at in their process to become an activity-friendly community. So we're going to explore a couple of these options today, and you're going to join me. We're going to take a pause here from the slideshow. And if you all would like to check out the link that's here on the page, you can also scan the QR code. I'm actually going to change over my view so that you can see what the Google search looks like. So one moment here while I transition. All right, so we're going to go ahead and just search everyday destinations. And we'll see that the first link that comes up is from APA. You'll see here, this is our project landing page. We have some basic information about the project as well as a blog roll with a connection to 15 different strategies that might help you figure out, is this something that might work for my community? We also identify the organizing mechanism for all of the different suggestions that we have for activities, as well as overarching considerations to make sure that this is implemented in a way that includes the community. So lots of different ideas here. We also do provide some background information if some of these terms feel unfamiliar, or if you'd like to learn more about some of the terms that we're using, this is the page to reference. So if you decide that you do want to check out some of the blog posts, we have some options here. This is the introductory blog post, which includes a lot of information on the context behind the project and different pieces on how public health and planners can work together. This is a pretty important part of the conversation. Our goal with creating this product was to speak to a broader audience than potentially just planners and figure out how we might be able to connect across sectors to advocate for active living. So down here at the bottom, we have some recommendations for public health professionals on how they might be able to use the series. A lot of this information is centered around familiarizing oneself with the role of the built environment in public health and how public health professionals might be able to collaborate with decision makers or folks who are able to influence decisions in their communities to advocate for change. And then we also have recommendations for planners and built environment professionals on how they might be able to use this series. And a lot of that comes back down to highlighting that connection between health and the built environment. And again, recommending change collaboratively with public health professionals and others who are interested in the conversation. So this is a really cool project where we got to combine a lot of different resources and highlight some areas where there was potentially not a whole lot of information on there. Before moving back to the PowerPoint, I'm going to go ahead and share one more thing, which is a sample blog post for you. And we'll talk about some of the common elements. So each blog post contains an introduction. We also see equity considerations here. So these are things that you want to consider if you want to make sure.
Sorry to interrupt. I think what you are showing is lagging in terms of what you are talking. So we are still not seeing the blog post, the sample blog post. Now we are. We can see connection to small and rural towns. Sorry for interrupting.
No, that's okay. That's got to be my internet connection. Thank you for letting me know, Sagar. And apologies for that delay. Okay, so this is what the blog post looks like if you missed it because of the lag. We have the introduction. We have equity considerations, so how to make sure or how we can implement some of these solutions while providing equitable benefits to all community members. Connections to small and rural towns, which we'll talk about in a moment. We also have case examples that illustrate how communities were able to implement some of these solutions in an equitable way. And then also recommendations for actions. And so these are titled as strategic points of intervention, which Sagar mentioned earlier, but these are where all of the action items are listed. And there's also links to additional resources that will say more about what that action looks like or provide an example of a place that's already implemented it. And then this is a key piece here, the potential partnerships section. This is where we explored what are some different opportunities to connect with people who care about the community and how to come together to, again, encourage physical activity. So I'm going to go ahead and move back to my main screen. Sagar, is that one showing up okay?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, thank you so much. All right, so now we're going to dive really briefly into, I know we're running a little bit short on time here. We're going to dive into some of the pieces of the conversation that you'll see throughout the blog posts. So one area where there were less resources available, and this is not just for physical activity and everyday destinations, but kind of speaking broadly, we have less resources available for small and rural towns, and acknowledging some of the different elements of the conversation that might be present in those settings when compared to urban settings. So some of the common elements that we do talk about is limited resources and how to juggle varying priorities with community members. There's also unique characteristics. So how are small and rural towns changing? What are some of the historic pieces that play an important part in deciding what the future of the community is going to look like? All of these things are going to influence how a planning approach is implemented and how folks engage in physical activity. That's not to say that this tool doesn't apply to larger communities. It certainly does. There are just a couple of other considerations that we need to keep in mind when we're talking specifically about small and rural towns. And then one of the key pieces here for the conversation is equity considerations. So if we think back to how the description for everyday destinations, one of the key pieces on there is that they're desirable. These are places that people want to live by, which can lead sometimes to negative externalities. So we have spent some time thinking about how can you make sure that community members across the board benefit from these investments, these community changes. And so there are recommendations for avoiding displacement. A lot of those come back to what are housing options that are available for the community and how do they connect to the broader network of everyday destinations, and what are some options to make sure that these spaces are safe to walk, bike, or roll while, you know, kind of just promoting change at the same time. So it is a very challenging conversation to have at times, but planners and other decision makers and community members can take steps to make sure that there are equitable benefits for the community, and that it's not just walkable for some, but hopefully encourages physical activity for all. We have, we showed earlier the division of activities. So our action framework is, again, those 5 strategic points of intervention. I'm not going to go into this. There's an explanation on the project page. But one thing that is important to note is that these are all different points in time when planners might be able to affect change into a decision-making process. So these steps are not sequential. However, they are organized in a way that starts off with like the creation of an idea or possibly bouncing around different options for how a community might be able to move forward to steps that are closer to an outcome, right? So if you're starting off with community visioning and goal setting, those are conversation times, those are opportunities to decide what can we do next. Whereas when you're moving closer to public investment or development work, you're thinking about, okay, well, there are projects coming down the pike. What can we do to go ahead and integrate that physical activity element into the conversation? So all of the blog posts are organized with these different categories. And so there are multiple options. If there are opportunities to implement these in the community, you can, again, just start off at any one of these points. It doesn't necessarily have to be something where you're starting off from a community visioning or goal setting activity. And then we do talk a lot about collaboration. So the emphasis of the product is highlighting that connection between public health and planning, and then also bringing in community members' perspectives, right? So planners are not interested in being prescriptive. It's more about how can you elevate the voices of the folks in the community to make sure that the changes are addressing their concerns, and again, you know, resulting in equitable benefits. So there are opportunities to connect with the public and then also connect with local stakeholder groups or partner groups, including local organizations, institutions, local government practitioners, and many more. And then I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Sagar to tell us a little bit more about overarching considerations.
Thank you, Joe. In the interest of time, I'll maybe a little bit quickly go over the remaining slides, but what we want to do is we want to talk about like 2 to 3 planning approaches that you can just give an example or flavor of what the product or the blog post contain. Before that, this is important to consider some factors to consider when you are selecting an approach, because like, well, you have given us 15 things, what should we do? That's the question. And it depends on the community. It's an easy answer, it's a cliche and easy answer to say, but it really does depend on the community context, right? It depends on what type of resources are available. It depends on whether a community has in-department capability and technical skills. If not, then do they have access to technical assistance? It depends on, we have found that communities, and I think this is common logic, that communities with presence of partnerships or existing partnerships are really great in terms of implementing these approaches and implementing the work faster than the ones that don't have, that have absence of partnerships. Doesn't mean that they should not do, it's just that start with building those partnerships and then implement plans. How agile the local regulatory agencies and the changes are. Some communities, it's really hard to do regulatory changes. Some communities it's not. And planning and any of the things that land use, zoning, etc. we talk does require some types of changes, and that may take, depending on how agile the community is. Think about the readiness of the change that community members wants to experience, right? Some community members may only sort of go for incremental changes. In that way, do small changes and move forward. If not, if there are major changes needed, then do that. But think about community readiness when you select those approaches. Another thing to talk about is, I think Joe Peña made an important point, and I would again re-emphasize that point, that the center of the work that we have done is to help create equitable development. So some strategies, or all strategies, I think that we have mentioned, as Joe mentioned, create desirable neighborhood, right? Which may lead to cause disproportionate effect or benefits for some people and adverse impact on other people. And it can be stressed enough that solutions to avoid and minimize harmful consequences should be implemented along with the strategies. It cannot be just do green infill development and then not do the surrounding things which would make that particular community more affordable for residents that are already living there. The centerpiece is like the keep community members and local partners at the center of decision-making process. And if that is done, I think there's an important aspect to think about when you are implementing these strategies that we are going to, or approaches that we are going to talk about. Also, there is one equity-related case example that we have focused on each of the blog posts. However, we would like to just say that there are a lot of examples from different communities and links to different resources that you can find in the blog post. So it's not only one example, there are a lot of other examples that you can see of how other communities have done this. Next slide. So now we'll briefly and very quickly talk about, give a flavor of 3 approaches that we have part of this project. The first one is adaptive reuse. It is a practice of remodeling or repurposing an underutilized building to fulfill the different needs than the land use that it was intended to be used, right? So you can change the use and repurpose the existing space or unused space into something useful and into everyday destination. It is something that is sort of lower cost, we are saying, because we are not creating a destination from ground up. you have something in place, you have a building. We are not saying that it's not. It is cheap. It's just that lower cost, has this lower cost than the other approaches that we have also mentioned in the products. And it also helps to maintain the character and the traditional design that is very important to small and rural towns, because there is already a building available. They have a facade. It has design characteristics that can be preserved when repurposing that building. Next slide. And in this particular blog post, we talk about, in terms of equity-based example, we talk about a town in New York. I'm not going to try to pronounce this because I don't think I can, but it's a town with 65,000 people living. What happened was they had a 100-year-old property, which was unused and had great access to actually nearby central business district, but it was not being used. So what they did was they adaptively reused this particular building into a 155 unit housing complex that you see on the right hand side. And they use adaptive reuse to do just that. And the project was fulfilled because of the partnerships, multiple partnerships and funding from organizations for renovations, right? So, and partners included local entities, including government, YMCA, local YMCA, etc. State offices like Historic Preservation Office of New York, and some private sector funding and partners that were really helpful in terms of implementing the adaptive reuse and actualizing this project into something useful that people can live and have access to nearby destinations. I'll hand it over to Joe to talk about the next two approaches.
Thank you, Sagar. So another approach that we cover in the blog series is mixed use developments. So when we think of mixed use, we can think of mixed use in terms of vertical mixed use. So what's happening on one lot, is it a storefront at the bottom, residential space at the top, or maybe some other function for the community. We can also think about mixed use in terms of horizontal mixed use. So is there a district where you see small scale industrial uses, or residential spaces or shops located within close proximity to one another? This is something that deviates from standard land use practice, which is separating all land uses out by specific functions. And it does encourage physical activity. So our case here for this approach is to reduce the distance between different destinations and have kind of that critical mass of places that folks can visit, or they need to visit in order to take care of childcare, grocery shopping, etc. In small and rural communities, there might already be spaces like this. So if you think of a main street, for example, there might be multiple uses or shops or spaces to live that are within walking space. But in some instances, you might need to think about whether it makes sense to retrofit some of those single use approaches to encourage, again, that connection between destinations. And then we do have an example from Missoula, who created an area plan to think about connected community areas, so focusing on that activity-friendly routes piece, and then also thinking about how to make sure that it was accessible to all community members in terms of housing, right? So one of their stronger emphasis was providing a greater array of housing options so that folks could live in mixed income communities, as opposed to maybe just catering to one segment of the population. Some of the potential partners that we identified here for this strategy, not just for the case example, but for the whole strategy or approach, includes community members, developers, institutions, housing authorities, transit authorities, environmental health professionals, etc. These are folks with knowledge of the community, and then they might be connected to different opportunities for mixing up those land uses, and folks that might be able to make use of new spaces such as commercial storefronts or housing developments. Another planning approach that we talk about is green space improvements. This is something that we might think about in connection to physical activity, but there are opportunities to integrate those green space elements into community spaces and encourage more physical activity if they're in smaller scales, or to elevate existing resources within a small or rural community. So if you think about a town that might be located further away from an urban center, there might be access to parks or potentially significant natural landmarks that might attract different visitors. They might also have access to trails for biking, walking, or rolling. And then there are a couple of other connections to small and rural communities, including providing environmental services. So thinking about clean air, clean water, protection from hazards, and then also attracting and retaining community members. If it's beautiful, folks are less likely to move away. Our example for this approach is from Eugene, Oregon, where there was a significant change in population, specifically thinking in terms of population growth and also demographic changes, which sparked a conversation on how to have inclusive public park spaces that serve the community that's there at the time, and also the projected community members who will be there in the future. And so they, at the time when we were writing this, they were actively implementing some of those park improvements through public investments. Again, just thinking about how can you provide some of those equitable benefits for all members of the community. And in this case, some potential partners include, park professionals, different planning folks, of course, community members and membership organizations that are interested in green spaces, and local businesses who might have an interest in the conversation. So we are wrapping up this conversation and transitioning to questions here in just a moment. But before we do that, we did want to share with you that hopefully the takeaway from this conversation is that there's lots of opportunities to enter that conversation on encouraging physical activity in your communities. Sometimes planning can feel a little foreign or perhaps removed from daily activities, but planners are interested in hearing the perspectives of community members, and they're interested in collaborating with allied professionals who are seeking to improve the health of their communities. So we do hope that this tool is useful to you in identifying what can I do, how can I go about implementing this in my own neighborhood or perhaps in the communities that I serve, through partnerships, connecting with counterparts who are interested in that conversation, and then also figuring out what are other folks already up to in my community and how can we make it more receptive for folks who are interested in physical activity. And then one last plug, we do have another product coming out here in the next couple of weeks. It's called Fostering Healthy Communities Through Planning and Public Health Collaborations. And so what this is a shorthand guide for folks who are interested in sparking those connections across silos. If you're not a planner or public health professional, there might be some tips in here for you as well on how to go about getting started with connecting with counterparts in other professions, identifying shared interests and collaborating towards action. So that is our presentation. Thank you so much for joining in today. We're looking forward to questions. Hopefully we can get some answers to you before the top of the hour. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm gonna kick it off. Thank you so much. And I really appreciate the emphasis here. As America Walks, we're often thought of as being an active transportation organization, so that our work is therefore restricted to the streetscape, sidewalks and crosswalks. We of course interpret it much more broadly than that because there's so many things that affect walkability, including just whether places are welcoming, to someone based on their appearance or race or disability or the like. It's far more than physical infrastructure. But I really appreciate the emphasis on destinations as part of this discussion. And I guess the question I'd ask is, you'd mentioned earlier unintended consequences, and so much of the planning was separating uses from each other, and two of the items you mentioned, adaptive reuse and mixed use, it's not responding merely to demand, right? Like we need funding or is there demand for this thing, but then you run into an obstacle of, well, the rules don't allow us to put housing in that space, or the rules don't allow us to have commercial and housing in the same building. So to those folks that are interested in this type of work of how do we get more destinations, and given the history, you know, of existing plans, what would you say to somebody like, what's your starting point? How do I get in there and, you know, and work with planners to get my city to start at the very top level planning differently, not just this block or this street, but at the beginning? What would it take to kick off a change for somebody who wanted to see it, whether an advocate or a public health professional, or maybe even the business person who wants a different type of Main Street than they have, or doesn't want to build parking for their, as they seek to convert an old industrial building into a brewery or something, a tap room, you know? So there we go. I don't know who wants to take that first, Sagar or Joe.
I can start and then Joe can add. I think Joe shared the last slide where the second product we are developing exactly talks about it. It's like 4 pages to exactly know how you can start collaborating with planners. The first step, I think, is to know who those people are, right? And I think especially in small and rural towns, it's hard to find who are the decision makers, who is making land use decisions, who are making zoning codes, right? And it's about finding those people. Many times it is, it's not called planning. Sometimes it's village administrator doing it in small communities. Sometimes it's metropolitan planning organizations doing it. So once it's figured out, I think it's best thing is to, Mark Fenton mentioned this really well, was like, go to their events, right? So if planners are going to have a community-based event, go there and talk with them. And there is a misconception sort of that planners sort of don't, are for like Euclidean zoning and trying to separate uses, and not, the laws are not in place for mixed-use development or infill development or adaptive reuse. Planning is very political because planners do something and then it needs to be approved by city council and elected officials. Sometimes it becomes very political and it requires support from larger set of community members, including people that are, have NIMBYism, right? So they're like, well, it's not going to happen with my community. You can do it in some other community. So there are a lot of forces acting to do that. But I would confidently say, generally, if you go and start those conversations with planners, they would be on board, because the goal is, as I mentioned, to think about the welfare and the best interest of the people. I cannot say blanketly for every community, but most of the time, it's worth talking and starting that conversation so that we can find a way forward.
Well, I'm just, if you don't mind, Joe, I'm gonna follow up on that, because there was one nugget in there I thought that was really important. You know, and as you know, I was the mayor of a big city, and we had people who said planner right after them, right? And sometimes they were in departments. Sometimes there was a whole planning department. So in a smaller town or a smaller city, what might be the title after the person who's actually doing the planning? You know, if they can't afford to hire a full-time planner, who ends up doing the planning? Or is it in the town, or is it at the county, or is it at the state? You know, who might be doing planning in a community?
Jody, you want to take, or I can take?
Oh, I can start off with a joke, I guess. I think
Go
of
for it.
Parks and Rec, you know, Leslie Knope, how she is working in the Parks and Rec world, but she's actually doing a lot of planning for her community. It could really be anyone. I think we've talked to folks who are elected officials and are engaged in those conversations on planning. There's also zoning administrators, folks who are responsible for implementing the ordinances of the community. There might also be connections at the higher scales, right? So potentially at the county level, if it's an unincorporated area, there might be folks that are not exactly working at the municipal level, but maybe they have the title planner in their name, and they might also be connected with folks who are interested in that conversation on the like more local scale, or more at a small or rural town setting. So there's a lot of starting points, but Sagar, I don't know if you have any other ideas on connection.
No, I in a short, I would say there is no standard answer. I would say, though, most of the small towns and communities would have, of course, city website, and there will be some section somewhere about development, economic development. It can be public utilities. It can be building services. Those are the people who you can connect, and you'll find a thread of like who is making land use decisions, for example. Sometimes it's metropolitan planning organization providing those services. So yeah, don't want to consume all the time, but that's what I have to provide.
Well, I'm going to pull a question. Kate shared with me a question from the chat, which I think follows up on this one. Economic well-being seems to be weighted more heavily than physical and social well-being in many land use projects I'm aware of, i.e. businesses oppose removing parking or slowing car traffic. What is the role of planners in educating business owners about the benefits of multimodal transportation, health, safety, well-being? I want to expand that question a little bit because I don't think they're the only political actors in a city, right? Like, and you mentioned that, Sagar. You may have homeowners designed to preserve the character of their neighborhood and preventing the construction of affordable housing, right? Or you may have people who simply believe that ample parking downtown is the most important thing, which separates destinations. So what would you say, to this question? What's the role of planners in educating anyone, therefore, about the benefits of the plan? How do you deal with politics in the job? what do you do about that? So
Sagar talked earlier about some of these pieces, which is pretty interesting. But one of the things that comes to mind is this idea of a missed opportunity, right? So everything that we choose in a town comes at a cost. If we choose to have more parking in a downtown area, does that mean that it's going to be there's going to be less vitality or foot traffic, where you might occasionally have somebody who sees a storefront and decides to stop and support a local business owner? The questions of retaining community character too are pretty big. I think that one of the key pieces here, Sagar, you may have mentioned this before, but meeting communities where they're at, right? So it's a piece of, okay, well, what is at the core of this discussion? Like, what are the pieces here that are most valuable to a person? And then what are some of the community needs, right? So if you're in a community that's experiencing disproportionate effects, maybe you're seeing higher rates of obesity or diabetes or something, like, do we need more grocery stores, or do we need more access to farmers markets, or different things that are actually going to improve the conditions or lived experiences of residents or community members?
I would just add that this is the question where it's like rubber meets the road, right? I mean, there are good intentions everywhere, but how to like bring everyone together. Sort of what Joe was mentioning, but it's also about like planners when they're working on projects, especially bigger plans and etc. They have steering committees. They have educational opportunities. Like now, a lot of communities are, before doing like comprehensive planning, they have like a series of workshops where they would go into communities and then talk with the people that usually are not on the table and talk with them about the importance of like what is exactly what is land use, what is the role, what is the return of investment for you, like what is in for you. You need to create that buy-in for them. And sometimes it's not possible, sometimes it's difficult, sometimes it's possible in terms of bringing them to the other side, saying that, well, this is what we can do. But there needs to be more interaction between those specific groups that are like sort of saying no to these improvements.
And also identifying that compromise means that sometimes people walk away from a decision-making table with something, not everything, but something that they care about. So finding those core ideas that resonate across different groups is a good starting point if it's possible to get to that point.
So since we're almost at the hour, I'm gonna make a couple of announcements here. And then Sagar and Joe, I think, can hang out for a little more. So anybody who wants to hang on after the announcements, you'll get some free bonus content. You don't have to pay an extra price to get the special edition of the webinar. But if you like what we do at America Walks, which is pushing for equitable, inclusive, accessible, communities for all, mobility for all, really, please consider becoming a member. I think you got the wrong slide there, Kate, somehow. There we go. So please consider going to our website, making a donation to America Walks. We really count on individuals to support us as well. And the more of those small donations we get from more people, the more freedom it gives us to push for whatever we want, not just be responding to grant funding. So please, if you love the content, or even if you just like it, join us. We also have another great webinar teed up for next month in June 29th, same time of day, 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 on the Pacific, and the times in between. And this webinar is, we are now co-host of the Freeway Fighters Network. So talk about a single use, high-speed traffic disrupting the ability to walk or use transit or bike in a community. There are now communities, activists and advocates around the nation who are looking at either fighting highway expansion, removing highways, or capping highways to reconnect communities. We're a co-host of the freewayfighters.org network, and we're going to bring some of those folks to you next month to talk about that work. So please join us next month on that one as well. Okay, back to the question.
I'll just make one more announcement, Mike, if that's okay.
Go for it, Sagar.
I mean, if you don't know planning that well, you may have listened to a lot of jargons that maybe unintentionally we mentioned. If you go to planning.org, our website, and if you search for those things, maybe you'll get, so a lot of the materials that we create are for free. So you can basically, if you want to know what is adaptive reuse, etc., I mean, explore the website, you'll get a lot of information on what planning is and what planners do. Yeah.
No, this is important. And obviously in my role, I learned quite a bit about planning in my prior roles, both as an activist and as an elected official. And there are certainly layers of it, and being able to access it is important. I was just really struck by, again, coming from a big city context, the reflection that there are people in your town making plans, even if they aren't called a planner. I think it's a really, really important viewpoint, and that, the rules can be changed. Although I remember I was told one time by the head of our Department of Construction and Land Use, they said, yeah, everything in the code today that you don't like was put in there by somebody who thought it was a good idea, and they may still be around to argue for it. So there's an element of, that history guiding the future, that it does take work to change it, but it can be changed. It can be changed. Here's another question, and I might have an answer to it too. How can my city easily assess its level of activity inequality? I like that phrase, activity inequality, to focus and design walking activities coordinated with marginalized groups. How could I determine that?
Do you want to start, Mike? Or...
Yeah, I'll take a shot at it.
Yeah, take a shot, and then I have a couple of things to add. So
yeah, I think this is really interesting. It turns out that, to the person that asked that question, it turns out that there's actually, at a prior webinar we held with Dr. Lawrence Frank of Urban Design for Health, they actually have a lot of data. They've gotten enough data about physical activity and its relation to land use and other factors that you can actually make pretty strong predictions about the amount of walking is in a neighborhood or other physical activity based on the neighborhood attributes there. So there is a way, if you wanted to, if the questioner is still listening, if you want to contact us to dig into that city, that we might be able to be able to estimate that. But there may be other ways to do it as well, to gather that activity. So Sagar?
Yeah, I was going to say something along the same line, but there are, I think, 2, 3, 4 ways of doing this. One is getting some secondary data from sources like EPA as a smart location database, which goes at like a granular level to like block and block groups, which is really good to think about activity levels. And sometimes you have to do proxy. You have to use proxy, because if you do not have first and primary data, then it's about using proxy variables to determine, well, where people are walking in terms of presence of sidewalk, where are sidewalks present, where not is. All those things can be analyzed. Also, when it comes to planning, planners are really good at spatial analysis, which is identifying using geographical information systems to create maps and creating hotspots and cold spots and they can layer different, they can put layers on top of each other to see where is the inequities happening, what is happening with that neighborhood with different variables. So it is sort of really helpful to see those type of maps to identify. A lot of communities have done indexes, like where a health equity index, right? So those like have hotspots versus places where there is no much physical activity and there is no infrastructure supporting the physical activity. So those type of analysis planners do all the time. And so, yeah, again, I would say reaching out to them and seeing if they have some type of data.
You know, that's a great tactic as well, is to ask a city to do that analysis before asking them to change the code. What a great question that is, but to ask your city or town to do an analysis of the activity inequality based on existing data. What was the name of that database again? The EPA?
Smart Location Database.
EPA Smart Location Database. Okay. Yeah, it's very interesting because this is actually a big issue for the U.S. Department of Transportation as well, because the current administration has made it a priority that, you know, under Justice 40, that they should be investing in the places that really have been historically underinvested and need this the most. And they're actually asking the same question you are, which is how do we identify the places that need it most and make sure we're directing the money that way? But there are some resources available already. Any other questions, Kate? Do you think I should pull out of here?
I think you covered all the main ones. Somebody did ask if the APA Emerging Planners Group of Maryland have any upcoming events planned for the summer. I don't know if either one of you would know that, but somebody had asked that in the chat.
I wonder if they think that we're part of the different webinar series, because they put one on. Here was another question. Is there a good measure for displacement? And where is it best to find this information, or who collects it?
That's a tough question. I don't have an answer to that, frankly, because displacement is complex and there's a lot of academic research on it. I don't think in practice people are using it that much, because now people are also talking about cultural displacement. So, well, it's also about people moving, but it's also about like culture moving, and even if you accommodate those people, etc. So I don't.
Why don't you pull that apart a little bit? What is cultural displacement?
Cultural displacement is when you, let's say you have inclusionary zoning practices. You have measures in place in land use and zoning to include, to take care that people don't move out, right? So you are taking those things into consideration. Even then, when the built environment changes, when, for example, cafes come in, high-end restaurants coming in, those people feel, even if you're living in the same neighborhood, they feel that they have lost their culture, even living in the same place. And then they're forced to get displaced. They're like, well, now this is not the community that I have lived in the last 50 years. So even if they were not physically displaced, that is one that their culture is displaced. So now they are displacing. So that's what I meant.
So displacement, is there different types of displacement, and that itself is difficult to measure. Joe, any thoughts on this question? Measuring displacement and good resources for that?
Yeah, this is echoing what Sagar said, very challenging, I think, to measure. But a couple of ideas that come to mind include comparing historic income information for our neighborhood and then seeing how over time maybe those things have changed. So here in Chicago, we have neighborhoods that have been historically Latin communities, and then as the spaces become more desirable, folks who've lived there for a long time can no longer afford to live there. So if you're looking at that information of like median household income, maybe on a smaller, at the smallest size possible, you might be able to see like, okay, well, there might be displacement happening here. Also, cost of homes, like if you're seeing that there's a change in pricing for living accommodations, that could also be a signal that potentially you're seeing displacement happen, at least on an economic level. Yeah, Sagar was talking about some stuff that's a little bit more nuanced to understand, but definitely surveying your community and understanding, well, what are some of the changes that have happened here could be a useful tool. But yeah, very interesting question, and it's something I'm going to be looking into myself after our chat.
Well, maybe we can
create something on that.
Yeah. Well, maybe we can. One of the things we like to do is follow up with a blog post. So maybe we can add some resources to that at the end. Okay, one final question, and it can also be serve as a little bit of a close, if you like, is, one of the things I've seen in transportation planning is that there's been, the profession's been changing, right? From an older highway-centric, or car-centric style of planning, and to, we've now seen the rise of a more multimodal, active transportation focus. It's even reflected in the organizations, like the state highway traffic operations people have somewhat different approach to how streets should be designed than the National Association of City Transportation Officials. In transportation as a whole, are we also, in planning as a whole, are we also seeing kind of a transformation or, an emerging changes in the profession? And if so, what do you think they are?
Oh, that is a
So
very
deep. Now, I'm asking you to speak for the whole planning profession here, Sagar, but you guys
that is
work,
okay.
but you work for the Planning Association, so.
Yes, that is okay. And it's a very timely and appropriate question because we at APA realized that we have been doing the same. We have been guiding our members with the same things again and again, right? There are 100 documents in terms of how to create sustainable community and stuff like that. So we have been reflecting within ourselves in terms of what do planners need to manage the change, because changes are coming and it is happening at a rapid pace nowadays. So we are doing a practice called foresight practice, where we are teaching communities to use foresight as a tool to think about future. So planners are, of course, when they're doing comprehensive planning and stuff, they are thinking about future, but actually thinking about the aspects that they may not have considered, and think about that and then plan for that. One of the biggest disruptors that we are seeing right now is technology. And that is going to impact transportation, housing, health. It's going to have a large impact, and the changes are happening at a faster pace than what we are expected for 5 years. So we are creating a lot of, I think the planning profession is changing in that way, in terms of becoming more technologically aware, even though there is a lot of pushback in terms of, well, this is not going to happen, but it's going to happen, right? We know how smartphones changed our life. There was a research done in 1985 that how much computer would change planning, and 20% of people only thought that computer would change planning, and see what is happening now. So it's about trying to think about future in a real way, teaching them techniques of forecasting, of backcasting, of learning from the past, but thinking about future and those type of things. That's what we are mainly focusing on very much at APA.
Joe?
And I think, yeah, to add to that, the human element of that conversation as well. So, there's some serious conversation happening around what skills do planners need in order to engage in the sorts of conversations that lead to fruitful benefits for a community. So what does it look like for planners to build up those public engagement skills, to be able to build long-standing relationships that are going to, encourage trusting back and forth dialogue with folks, and kind of challenge some of the changes of the past. So technology, but also like, let's be people and care for the spaces we live in, and care for our communities, and try to envision a better tomorrow and actively move towards a better tomorrow. No pun intended.
That's okay.
Thank you.
In a multiracial, multicultural society like ours, public, if we're truly to meet our ideals, public engagement is, and those skills about how to engage the public in it are critical. But I'm also reminded of what's the Casey Stengel line? Predicting things is hard, especially the future.
Yeah. It's about scenario planning, right? It's about preparing for multiple scenarios.
Right.
That's what is important. You need to not prepare for only one thing, but for multiple scenarios.
Not to predict, but to plan for multiple things.
Multiple things. And one thing to add actually on what Joe mentioned, very important thing, that we are also, this answers one of the questions which was asked in terms of how to reach out to like business owners or NIMBY groups that are not with you when it comes to multimodal transportation or any other things that you want to do for health. Like planners, as when they are in school, they don't learn about communications. They don't know how to specifically do public engagement. Some do. I'm saying generally they're not, right? So we are also feeling we are doing something like upscaling in terms of improving the human soft skills of planners and having them understand about communications, about cultural competency when they go and talk with community members, etc. So all those things are happening as well, which is very important to wherever we want to move forward.
Thank you so much for joining us today. And to our remaining audience, thank you for sticking around for the bonus section. And we
Yeah,
look
thank
forward
you.
to seeing you all in the future. Thank you again.
Thank you
Thank
so
you
much,
all.
Mike.